Now, the government's advisor on poverty caused a bit of a stir this week when she suggested freezing council tax might not be a very good way of tackling poverty. She also made some fairly gnomic remarks about other universal benefits and about whether young people are treated fairly by the benefit system. Well, let's try to find out exactly what she meant. Naomi Eisenstadt joins me now from Dunstable. Well, first of all, Naomi Eisenstadt, the council tax freeze, why is it you think it should be phased out or even just abolished?
There is currently a commission on local tax reform. It's going to take a while to get that commission to make their recommendations. In the meanwhile, particularly from 1718, the reason that the council tax freeze doesn't help poor people is that the poorest people don't pay council tax. It does help better off people because housing hasn't been revalued for the last 25 years. So people living in the most expensive properties, where their properties have gone up in value, their taxes haven't changed. And I think that this is benefiting better off people. The reason it's a disadvantage to poor people is that local authorities need the funding to fund services that mainly help the poorest people.
So, in effect, what you're saying is the council tax freeze subsidises middle-class people and doesn't really do very much for the poor because they wouldn't be paying council tax anyway.
Exactly. I mean, in the not paying council tax, that's because the Scottish Government progressively does have ways of helping the poorest families, which doesn't happen in England. So I think there are progressive things that the Scottish Government is doing, but this particular one, I think that local authorities need more discretion over their spend, and the way they get that discretion is by deciding for themselves what to charge for property tax. One thing about property tax is it's easy to collect because you can't move your house offshore. You can't hide that you own the property. So it's a good tax. It's a progressive tax. It could be a progressive tax.
What about other universal benefits which are provided by the Scottish Government? Does your argument not apply similarly to them?
It certainly applies to things like the fuel subsidy that all older people get. I get the older people fuel subsidy. I think that's wrong. My income is fine, and I don't even have to ask for it. So I think that there are some universal benefits in times of austerity, and I think particularly pensioners have benefited enormously from the,
I was thinking of something like prescription charges. The fact you've got, wouldn't your argument apply equally? There were systems whereby people who were poor didn't pay for prescriptions, and since they've been abolished, that's arguably subsidising the middle classes in exactly the same way that you say the council tax freeze is.
All universal benefits obviously help everyone, not just the poorest. The difficulty is that there's a balance between, first of all, just the bureaucracy in administering means-tested benefits, which can be costly, and sometimes the stigma associated with means-tested benefits, against how do you spend your money most effectively. And I think that we have gone too far in Scotland on the universal side, not far enough on the targeting. And I think on the targeting, we need to make the culture of public services more respectful and therefore avoid stigma that way.
Do you think we've gone too far on an issue like tuition fees?
Well, it's interesting on tuition fees. I think free tuition fees are a good thing, obviously. I think that the argument I'm making about better chances for young people is that we haven't put a comparable effort, energy, and thinking into those young people who aren't going to go to university. So there's been a lot of work on employability. There's the Young People's Task Force on Employment. But just as we spent a huge amount of time and energy and effort in the UK on understanding under fives, and we've now won the argument on under fives in terms of what a crucial period of life it is, one of my recommendations in the report is to think much more carefully and do a lot more research on what works for older children and young adults, in the sense that
Sure, but can I just ask you specifically about the tuition fees? Because there are people who argue that the money that it costs to have free tuition would be better spent on giving grants so that more people from disadvantaged backgrounds can get into further education, or indeed to help, as you say, the half of the people who don't go into further education.
Well, I think that I would like to look much more carefully first at what policies would help, how much they cost, and then if you need to even it out. I wouldn't want to say, let's do away with tuition fees before we say, have some evidence on what would replace it. So I think that what I'm recommending in the report is the current policies in place for apprenticeships, for relationships between employers and schools need to be strengthened. They need more urgency. But I think we need a wider review on older children, young adults more generally, before we say the policy should be to take money away from one group and give it to the other, because we don't know what needs to be done to give it to the other. I just don't think we've done enough thinking and analysis and data on this.
Do you think there is an argument for having at least some universal benefits? The argument that is generally made on things like child benefit is that it gives the middle classes a stake in the welfare system. If you means test everything, then better off people think, well, this welfare system, it's got nothing to do with me, so I resent having to pay for it. Whereas if you get a benefit from it, even if it's something like child benefit, you think, well, I've got a stake in it.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, my argument would be on child benefit, but of course we lost the argument, would be to keep it universal, but to tax it as part of income. Why shouldn't it be part of family income and subject to the same taxes, so that better off people would pay it as part of would pay back as part of their income tax, not the whole amount. But it's much easier to administer a universal benefit than a targeted benefit. And of course, I believe in universal NHS and I believe in a universal education system. But a universal NHS doesn't mean everybody gets the same. It means everybody gets what they need.
Okay, I was very struck in your report that you made a slightly ambivalent comment about the possibility of the Scottish Government introducing reforms to the welfare system. You urged caution because you said you were worried about tampering with the UK-wide benefit system. What did you mean?
Well, unless you had complete devolution, then you're tied into some of the UK benefits. One of the most damaging in my consultation with poor people when I was doing the report was things like sanctions. Sanctions against people on unemployment benefit who don't turn up for their interviews. One of the women I spoke to actually was sanctioned while she was in hospital on a ventilator. And the Scottish Government is not allowed to do anything to mitigate sanctions. So you mess with one bit of the system, but other bits of the system are still in place. Basically, there's a fundamental tension in benefits, which is the simpler you make them, the more rigid they are. The more complicated you make them, the more flexible they are to account for particular circumstances, but they're difficult to administer. And that balance between simplicity, so that they're clear and everybody understands how it works, which is the purpose of universal credit, the simplicity makes them rigid and therefore for many people unfair.
Okay, we are running out of time. I just wanted to return to something you said about older people. Winter fuel allowance and so on. Do you think there is too much of a bias against young people in the political debate? Do you think we have to look again? Every time there are reforms, the old age pension is protected, things like you mentioned, winter fuel payments are protected. Do you think we need to have another look at that?
Absolutely. And I mean, I count myself as one of them. I think that the reforms have been overprotective towards older people, and it shows up in the data. If you look at poverty rates in Scotland, the only group that is better off after housing costs rather than worse off after housing costs is older people. If you look at families with children, after housing costs, the poverty rate increases. If you look at young adults without children, after housing costs, the poverty rate increases. For older people, it decreases. All right. Look,
Naomi Eisenstadt, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, Naomi Eisenstadt hasn't been the only one to indicate concern about how we fund local services. Earlier this